A billionaire's baby wouldn't stop screaming until a black nanny picked him up. No one knew why, until a DNA test revealed the unthinkable. The Hargrave estate stood like a fortress of wealth and silence, except for one sound that echoed endlessly through its marble halls, the high-pitched, desperate cries of a baby. Day and night, the infant son of billionaire tech mogul Elliot Hargrave wailed with a force that pierced glass and patience alike. No white noise machine could drown it out. No lullaby soothed it. The child's sobs seemed to come from a place deeper than hunger or discomfort, something raw, something untouchable. The nursery had been redesigned 3 times. Dozens of nannies, certified, vetted, and lauded, had come and gone, each leaving, within days, some in tears themselves. Pediatric specialists were consulted, feeding schedules revised, hypoallergenic formulas and imported sleep aids stocked by the case. Nothing helped. The moment anyone reached for him, he stiffened, screamed, flailed like his tiny body was rejecting the world. And then came Grace. She wasn't from a premier agency. Her resume was modest. A handful of families in more ordinary zip codes had sung her praises. That was all. Desperation had opened the door. Elliot, exhausted and stone-faced, gave a silent nod when she arrived. His wife, Victoria, tall and porcelain-skinned, stood beside him with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "This will likely be a short trial," she said crisply, arms folded across her tailored cream blouse. Grace simply nodded. Her voice was low, and even when she finally spoke, "I understand." She stepped quietly into the nursery, the cries growing louder as she approached. The baby's red, tear-streaked face was turned toward the ceiling, tiny fists clenched, throat raw. From the hours he had spent screaming, Grace didn't flinch. She didn't coo or chatter nervously like the others had. She knelt slowly and reached out, not like someone trying to take control, but like someone asking permission. And when she lifted the child into her arms, the air in the room changed. Crying stopped, not lessened, not paused, stopped. A silence fell so sudden it felt sacred. The baby blinked, whimpered once, and then, just like that, nestled against her shoulder and exhaled a sigh that sounded almost relieved. Within minutes, he was asleep. Down the hall, Elliot Hargrave looked up from his phone and froze. Victoria, standing stiff at the doorway, narrowed her eyes. It wasn't just unusual. It was unnatural, she thought. Unsettling. Grace emerged a few minutes later, gently rocking the baby, humming a melody so faint it could have been mistaken for a breath. She offered no pride, no performance. Just a quiet glance toward Elliot. "He's resting," she said softly. Elliot couldn't respond. He was watching the boy's chest rise and fall. Peacefully, for the first time in weeks, Victoria looked from the baby to Grace and back again. Her expression was unreadable. But behind her carefully controlled features, something sharp and jealous began to take root. Grace didn't notice. Or maybe she did, but chose not to engage. She looked down at the boy in her arms, her fingers gently brushing the crown of his head. And for just a moment, her face shifted. Her eyes shimmered, not with triumph, but with something quieter. Something older. A sadness that didn't have words, because something about him that felt familiar. And deep in her chest, something stirred that had been buried for years. Grace returned the next morning at precisely 7 a.m., dressed in her simple cardigan and flats, her hair neatly pinned back. She was early, even though no one had asked her to be. She had always believed that when a child trusted you, you didn't make them wait. By the end of the first week, it was no longer a question. She was working full-time. The baby's name was Caleb, and Caleb, it seemed, had made up his mind. Grace was the only one he wanted. When others reached for him, he screamed. When Victoria tried to feed him, he twisted away. When Elliot cradled him, the crying paused, polite almost, but never settled. But when Grace entered the room, he lit up. His cries softened, his fists unclenched. His tiny body leaned toward her even before her arms opened. It should have been a relief. After all, the household had known no peace for weeks. But for Victoria Hargrave, it wasn't peace. It was replacement. At first, she pretended not to notice. She'd linger in the hallway, pretending to scroll through emails, watching Grace carry her son like a secret only she understood. Watching Caleb nestle into her shoulder with a familiarity that Victoria had never been able to earn. And then came the bitterness. "I'm still his mother," she snapped one afternoon, when Elliot gently suggested they extend Grace's contract, indefinitely. "You act like she's some kind of miracle worker." "She's helping," Elliot replied carefully. "That's all. She's helping our son sleep." But Victoria wasn't convinced. She saw it in the way the staff smiled more at Grace than at her. She heard it in the kitchen whispers about how natural Grace was, how the baby seemed meant for her arms. Meanwhile, Grace said nothing. She never stepped out of line, never acted superior. She spoke only when spoken to, and always with calm humility. But behind her gentle eyes she carried something unspoken, something that occasionally flickered across her face when she looked at Caleb a moment too long. It wasn't just affection, it was recognition. Late one evening, after Caleb had fallen, asleep in her arms, Grace stayed a little longer in the rocking chair by the nursery window. The moonlight poured across the soft cream walls, casting silver shadows on the floor. Caleb's breathing was steady now, his head resting against her chest. She began to hum. It wasn't a tune from any children's album or baby playlist. It was something older. A lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her. A melody woven with gentle hums and whispered rhythm, passed down like an heirloom through generations. Grace hadn't sung it in years, not since her son. Her breath caught. A memory, sharp and painful, surged forward. She had been 23, alone in a cold hospital room. The labor had been difficult, the hours long. But she had held on. She remembered the nurse's tight voice, the rush of commotion, the final scream, and then the stillness. They told her the baby hadn't made it. A complication, they said, something vague, unpreventable. She asked to see the body. They told her he'd already been taken. That it would be too painful. That it was better to remember him how she imagined. But she never could imagine him, because something about it never made sense. Her family mourned quietly. The hospital sent flowers and bills, and Grace buried the ache deep inside her, folding it into silence. And yet here she was, humming that same lullaby to a child who should have had no reason to recognize it. But he did. Caleb stirred. His small hand reached up and grabbed her finger with sudden urgency. Then came the sound, a soft, contented coo. Grace froze, her eyes welled. She hadn't even realized she was crying until a tear rolled onto Caleb's blanket. She blinked hard, swallowed, and looked away from the window. Behind her, just outside the nursery door, Victoria stood in silence, one hand on the frame. Her lips parted ever so slightly. She hadn't meant to listen, but she had heard the lullaby. She had seen the boy's reaction, and something about the look on Grace's face as she held her child, that deep, aching stillness, made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Victoria's eyes narrowed, not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Because, in that moment, she didn't see a nanny. She saw something she couldn't explain, something she couldn't control. The Hargrave mansion, though expansive and designed for silence, had corners where whispers clung like dust, lingering long after the speakers had passed. It began subtly, as all household gossip does, a muttered comment by the kitchen door, a glance exchanged between housekeepers during afternoon tea prep, a lowered voice from the driver as he waited in the foyer. "Did you see how he only smiles for her? She barely speaks, but he's glued to her. There's something strange about it, no?" By the second week, speculation had spread. Some of the staff called it a miracle, that perhaps Grace was gifted, touched by something divine. Others weren't so kind. She's manipulating him somehow. Babies don't just ignore their own mother. She's up to something. Mark my words. Grace had grown used to being overlooked, but being watched? That was harder to ignore. She noticed how conversations shifted when she entered the room, how doors that used to remain open were now closed behind her. The kitchen, once a place of casual kindness, now pulsed with tight smiles and withheld greetings. One afternoon, while folding Caleb's laundry in the quiet back room near the pantry, Grace heard two maids whispering just around the corner. "Mrs. Hargrave isn't happy, says the baby doesn't even look at her anymore. Can you blame her? He acts like that Nanny's his mother. I heard she's thinking of letting her go." A pause, a sigh. "Won't be easy. Mr. Hargrave likes her. The baby loves her." Grace held the tiny onesie tighter than she meant to. Her knuckles turned white. She stared at the little stitched bear on the chest pocket and felt something in her shift. Not fear, she had known that all her life. No, this was something colder. Resolve, but she said nothing. She folded the rest of the clothes with steady hands, even as her heart beat in her throat. Meanwhile, Elliot Hargrave was beginning to see Grace through a different lens. Not as an employee, not even as a temporary fix, but as a quiet presence that brought a strange serenity into his chaotic home. Caleb had started sleeping through the night. His tantrums had diminished. The household, once tense and on edge, now moved with a calmer rhythm. Elliot had even started working from home more often, finding excuses to pause by the nursery, just to watch Grace hum softly as she cradled his son. She never sought attention. She never overstayed her welcome. But she was the only one Caleb reached for without hesitation. Still, Elliot knew his wife was growing restless. And it all came to a head one evening, just after dinner, in the echoing stillness of the drawing room. Victoria stood near the fireplace, her silhouette sharp against the flickering light. Her arms were folded tightly, her jaw clenched. "She's too close to him," she said without preamble. Elliot looked up from the document he was reviewing, brow furrowing. "She's doing her job. Exceptionally well. She's doing more than that." Victoria's voice trembled, not with fear but fury. "That boy acts like I'm a stranger. He screams when I hold him, but he rests like an angel the moment she walks in. It's unnatural. She has a gift, you've said so yourself." "No!" Victoria snapped, stepping forward. "No, this isn't just instinct. This is something else, some kind of manipulation. Maybe even—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "Something darker." Elliot blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "You think she's using voodoo?" "I didn't say that." Victoria's face flushed. "But don't you think it's strange? The timing, the way he changed overnight?" He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A test," she said firmly. "Not for paternity. I know he's yours. I want a DNA test between her and Caleb." Elliot's eyes narrowed. "That's absurd." "Is it?" She shot back. "You've seen the way he looks at her, like he knows her." Silence stretched between them. "I just want to be sure," Victoria added, softer this time. "I want the truth." Elliot closed the folder in his lap and leaned back slowly in the leather armchair. The flicker of flames danced across his features, casting shadow and light in equal measure. He didn't like the idea. It felt invasive, conspiratorial, but something in Victoria's desperation clung to him, and he had seen it too. That spark between Grace and Caleb that defied explanation. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Fine, quietly, no one tells her." Victoria exhaled, satisfied, but neither of them could have imagined what that test would reveal. Not even close. The samples were collected under the guise of routine health monitoring. A swab across Caleb's cheek during his nap, handled gently by a private technician hired through one of Victoria's silent contacts. Grace was told nothing. She wouldn't have suspected anything even if she had noticed the extra presence in the house. She was too busy calming Caleb after yet another failed attempt from Victoria to rock him to sleep. Later that evening, while Grace was in the nursery humming softly and swaying with Caleb against her chest, another technician arrived under the pretense of updating employee health files. A quick brush inside her cheek, a polite thank you, and it was done. Victoria barely concealed her anticipation. She checked her emails hourly. She had expected something odd, perhaps confirmation that Grace had been meddling in ways science couldn't fully explain. What she didn't expect was silence. Days passed. Then early one morning, an envelope arrived at the Hargrave estate. Thick, white, unmarked, slipped into Elliot's private office by a courier who didn't stay for a signature. The air was still as he sliced it open. He skimmed the summary first. His eyes moved quickly, then stopped, froze. Maternal match probability, 99.9%. The paper shook in his hands. He read it again, slower this time, his breath catching in his throat. Beneath the clinical formatting, the stark numbers and lab logos was something unfathomable. Grace was Caleb's biological mother. For a long time, he didn't move. He just stared at the page, willing the text to rearrange itself, to mean something else. But science didn't lie. Not like people. Not like systems. When he finally stood, the world felt crooked. He locked the envelope in his desk drawer, said nothing to Victoria, and spent the rest of the day moving through the house like a man underwater. That night, after the house had gone still and Grace had gone home, Elliot opened his laptop and pulled up Caleb's birth records. They looked normal, at first. Standard documentation, hospital stamps, signatures. But something tugged at him. A name in the corner, one of the attending nurses, sounded familiar. He searched her name, cross-referenced it with archived medical cases, and that's when the first crack appeared. The nurse had been part of a now-defunct private maternity clinic in Louisiana, shut down years ago amid allegations of unethical adoption practices, anonymous claims, missing paperwork, stillbirths that never reached the state coroner's office. Complaints swept away by expensive lawyers and silence. Heart pounding, Elliot clicked deeper. He found a court document buried in an old local news site, a woman's testimony. She'd given birth alone, poor, without support. Her baby had been declared dead within minutes. No photo, no body, just an apology and a signed death certificate. The woman's name was Grace Holloway. Elliot leaned back, his mind spinning. A flash of memory struck him. Grace in the nursery, holding Caleb, her eyes distant and full of a sorrow he didn't understand at the time. The way she'd hummed that lullaby like it had been etched into her bones. The way Caleb responded as if he'd known her since birth, because he had. The truth began to bloom, horrible and irreversible. Caleb had never belonged to Victoria. He had never been meant for this house, this life of polished marble and empty affection. He was born of a woman who was told he was gone, who had buried a ghost in her heart and still carried its weight. And now, without knowing it, she had found him again. But not by miracle, by theft. It all began to make sense, the baby's rejection of Victoria, his instant peace with Grace, something deeper than bonding, something primal, unbreakable. The lie wasn't just cruel, it was engineered. Someone, long ago, had chosen to place that baby in Victoria's arms and take him from Grace's. Elliot closed the laptop and buried his face in his hands. He didn't know what to do. If he told Grace, it would break her, and Victoria. If he stayed silent, the weight of the truth would consume him. But one thing was certain. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a reckoning. Elliot Hargrave had never been a man prone to emotion. He built his fortune on logic, on algorithms, on things that could be measured and predicted. But since receiving the DNA test results, nothing in his world felt quantifiable anymore. He began watching Grace, not with suspicion, but with something heavier. Reverence. A slow, unraveling ache. In the days that followed, he observed her from a distance through cracked doors and hallway reflections. There was something almost sacred in the way she cared for Caleb. Every movement was precise yet tender, like muscle memory from a life that had been stripped away and unknowingly returned. She never rushed, never raised her voice, and when she smiled at the boy, it was never for show. One afternoon, while Caleb napped beside the nursery window, Elliot lingered just outside and asked, casually at first, "Do you have any children?" "Grace," she turned slightly, her smile dimming at the edges. "We did." He waited. "I lost him," she said, folding a tiny onesie. "A long time ago, hospital said there were complications. He was premature. I never got to hold him." Her voice faltered. Her hands moved a little slower. "I asked to see him. They told me it would be too traumatic, that I should let it go, mourn and move on." She paused. "But I never really could." Elliot said nothing. He simply nodded, excused himself, and left the hallway with a weight in his chest he couldn't shake. That night, after the house quieted and the staff had gone, he asked Grace if she would stay a little longer. She hesitated, concerned, but agreed. The living room felt too large for just the two of them. Caleb was asleep in a bassinet nearby, wrapped in his favorite blanket. His tiny hand curled near his cheek. Elliot handed her the file without a word. A manila folder, thick with printed pages and heartbreak. Grace took it with both hands and looked at him, confused. Then she opened it. At first she blinked as if she couldn't read the words. Then her breath left her. She didn't cry, not at first. She just stared, frozen in place like her body had disconnected from her mind. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Maternal match, 99.9%. Her eyes jumped from line to line, as if hoping for a mistake. But there it was. Scientific. Absolute. And then she folded forward, the folder slipping from her lap as her shoulders collapsed. A long, broken sob ripped from her throat. Low and guttural, the kind that came from a place untouched for too long. Elliot moved to help her, but she raised a hand to stop him. She needed a moment, to sit with the grief, the horror, and the strange, aching joy of truth. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew he felt familiar, but I thought I was just imagining it. Just wishing." She covered her face with both hands. Elliot knelt beside her. "I'm so sorry." Grace looked up, her cheeks wet, her voice hoarse. "How could they do this? How could they take him from me? I would have given him everything. I loved him before I even held him." Her voice cracked. "He was mine, and they buried him in paperwork and lies." Elliot couldn't speak. What could he say to a woman whose motherhood had been stolen with signatures and sealed files? The silence stretched between them, thick, sacred, and full. On the table, the clock ticked softly. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. And between them, Caleb slept soundly, unaware of the truths that had unraveled around him. Grace leaned forward, brushing a soft hand across his forehead, whispering, "My baby, I found you." And in that moment, Elliot knew no amount of wealth could ever make this right, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time to make it honest. The calm did not last. Victoria found the test results 2 days later, by accident or perhaps fate. Elliot had tucked the manila folder behind a row of financial reports in his study, but she was searching for last year's tax filings when she saw her own last name peeking out from the edge of the paper. She opened it without hesitation. She read it twice. Then she screamed. The kind of scream that ripped through the marble walls of the Hargrave estate and sent the housekeeper scurrying from the hallway. Elliot came running, but it was already too late. She stood in the center of the room, shaking, holding the papers like a weapon. "You knew," she hissed, eyes blazing. "You knew, and you hid this from me." "Victoria, calm down. Don't you dare tell me to calm down. That woman, that nanny, she's not just some employee, Elliot. She's the baby's mother. The DNA says it. She has a claim." Elliot tried to speak, to explain, but she was already pacing, the folder trembling in her hands. "She could take him from us," she snapped. "She could go to the courts. She could destroy everything." "She doesn't want to destroy anything," Elliot said quietly. "She didn't even know." Victoria turned sharply. "And you believe her? Just like that? I've seen the way she holds him, the way he looks at her. You don't fake that." "Of course you'd say that," she spat. "You've been watching her like a puppy for weeks." The accusation stung, but he didn't respond. Instead, he sat heavily in the leather chair beside the fireplace, his shoulders slumping. "I ignored the signs," he murmured. "Back when we adopted him, I remember thinking some of the paperwork seemed rushed. The agency never let us meet the birth mother. Everything was done through third-party attorneys. I told myself it was normal, that we were just lucky." He looked up at her, eyes full of something that had been missing for a long time. Guilt. "But I should have known. I should have questioned it." Victoria stared at him in disbelief, as if the man before her had transformed into a stranger. Then, slowly, her expression hardened. "Fine," she said coldly. "If she wants a fight, she'll get one." The next morning, Grace was called into a private meeting with Victoria's attorney. The offer was simple: a generous financial settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, if she signed a non-disclosure agreement and relinquished any intention of pursuing custody. Grace didn't even look at the check. "I'm not interested in your money," she said softly. "I'm interested in my son." The lawyer blinked. "Miss Holloway, if this goes to court, it could get messy. The child has been in your employer's care since birth. The court may favor continuity." Grace's voice did not rise. "Then let them. I'll take truth over comfort." The lawyer tapped his pen, visibly unsettled by her calm refusal. Elliot found her later that day, seated on a bench just outside the garden, Caleb resting peacefully against her shoulder. The boy had begun reaching for her now, unprompted, his tiny hands tugging at her sleeve, his smile blooming like a sunrise when she entered the room. "I'm sorry," Elliot said, sitting beside her. She didn't speak, just adjusted Caleb's blanket and kept her eyes forward. "They offered you a way out," he added. "I'm not looking for a way out," she replied. "I'm looking for a way through," he nodded. "I can't undo what's been done," he said, voice tight, "but I'll stand with you in whatever comes next." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since the truth came out, she saw not a billionaire or an employer, but a man willing to admit he was wrong. "Then we'll face it together," she said. Behind them, the wind rustled through the trees. In the distance, Victoria stood on the balcony watching, arms folded, lips thin, and somewhere in the courthouse downtown, a custody petition had already begun to move across a judge's desk. The battle hadn't started yet. But the war for truth, for love, for motherhood had already begun. The hallway outside the courtroom was silent, save for the muffled echo of heels on polished tile and the distant shuffle of paperwork behind closed doors. Elliot stood alone near a window, his reflection faint in the glass. Sunlight painted golden streaks across his suit, but he didn't feel the warmth. He had spent his life building empires, companies, legacies, towers of glass and code. But now, standing here, he felt like a man who had lost something more important than any boardroom victory. For all his wealth, all his power, he had failed to protect the one innocent soul he'd been entrusted with. Caleb hadn't needed a mansion or private tutors. He had needed truth. He had needed her. Elliot's shoulders trembled. He braced one hand against the windowsill, his breath hitching as the weight of his decisions finally collapsed in on him. The lies, the silence, the comfort of looking the other way, it had all come at the expense of a mother's arms. A soft voice broke through the stillness. "You called for me?" He turned. Grace stood a few feet away, calm but guarded, her eyes cautious. He nodded. "Thank you for coming." She gave a small nod in return, shifting her purse on her shoulder. "I wanted to talk," he began, voice rough. "Before anything's finalized." She said nothing, but listened. "I know you have every right to take Caleb and never look back, and if you choose that, I won't fight it." He swallowed hard. "But I wanted to ask, what do you want?" Grace glanced down at her hands, then out the window. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for my son to be whole. Not torn between two realities, not caught in another war over ownership." Elliot's chest tightened. "I don't want to rip him out of the only life he's ever known," she continued, "but I do want to be his mother, to read him bedtime stories, to walk him to school, to be present Not in the shadows, not as the help, but as me. Elliot nodded, tears welling. Then that's what we do. They sat side by side in the waiting area as papers were redrafted. Grace would have full legal recognition as Caleb's biological mother. Elliot, still listed as his legal guardian, would share custody under a cooperative agreement. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Victoria didn't attend the final hearing. She had already packed her things the night before, her pride unable to survive the truth. She left a note for Elliot, brief, bitter, and final. No forwarding address. But as Elliot watched Grace buckle Caleb into his car seat later that afternoon, the boy reaching up to touch her face, with a sleepy smile he felt no sorrow for what he had lost, only gratitude for what was finally, painfully, being made right. The park was warm with the quiet hum of a late spring afternoon. Sunlight streamed through swaying trees, dappling the grass with gold. Children laughed in the distance, the wind carried the scent of fresh blooms, and the world, for once, felt still. Grace sat on a blanket beneath a tall oak, her arms wrapped around Caleb as he giggled and babbled nonsense into the soft curve of her neck. His chubby fingers clutched a small rubber toy, and his hair, kissed by sunlight, curled gently at the crown. She laughed with him, not the polite laughter of someone performing a role, but the full, rich laugh of a mother who knew her child was finally hers. Elliot approached quietly, dressed simply, no longer the image of a tech titan, just a man with sleeves rolled, holding a small paper bag. He knelt beside them, pulling out a sliced apple and a juice box. Caleb reached for it instantly, and Elliot smiled, not at the child, but at Grace. "You always knew," he said gently. Grace looked at him, her eyes soft. "I always felt him." They sat together under the tree, no contracts between them, no lies, just a boy, a mother, and the man who had helped rebuild the truth.